One of the things I find so frustrating in talking to people on the right is how difficult it is to convince them of the importance of narrative, of how difficult it is for them to understand how behind the curve we are when it comes to speaking to the country, whether it's through the news media, whether it's through the entertainment media, or whether it's through the academies. How have we let a failed, wicked, anti-freedom philosophy like leftism take over our colleges so that we save our money all our lives to send our kids off to be re-educated? How have we let the news media be taken over by these leftists so that we have to correct everything just to get the news right, and they're always ahead of us, creating this cloud of chaos around any Republican president, this cloud of that there's something wrong with every Republican president, whereas Barack Obama walks on water. How have we let them take over the movie business? Why? Or no, well, if we're so wealthy, if we're the party of the wealthy, why aren't our wealthy conservatives building movie studios where we can talk back to the people and maybe make movies that don't insult them and insult their country? You know, the other day I was watching Citizen Kane, rewatching Citizen Kane, because I hadn't seen it in a long time. And if you know anything about movies, on almost any list of movies around the world, Citizen Kane is listed as the greatest movie ever made. And I hadn't watched it in, 10, 15 years. And I'm sitting there watching Citizen Kane, this Orson Welles film from the 40s. And I'm sitting there thinking, how did anyone ever think that this is the greatest anything? It's a good movie. It's a good movie. And Orson Welles was a tremendously talented director, and it's a good movie. And I'm not knocking the movie. But I've never met a single person who says to me, this is my favorite film. I watch this film every year. Bring up Casablanca. Bring up The Godfather. Bring up Lord of the Rings. Any picture, Star Wars, that people watch over and over and over again because they just love it so much. Nobody loves Citizen Kane like that. And I started to think, well, why is this the greatest picture ever made? Why, the camera angles are creative and some of the way of storytelling is interesting and different. Again, good movie. But why is it the greatest? And I started to think, well, it really, really is an attack on William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaper owner who was a very strange and eccentric guy, but his real crime was that he was a conservative. He started out on the left and he drifted over to the right after World War I when he saw that he didn't want to, he became more isolationist and he became more right-wing as time went on. And this movie really rips him to shreds and just psychologizes him the way the left loves to do. You're just saying this because you think this or you think that instead of dealing with your arguments. And at no point in the movie, one of the fascinating things about this movie is it rips this guy, Citizen Kane, who's William Randolph Hearst, just rips into him. But there's never any real argument against anything he's doing. He's just kind of a careless, dishonest newspaper guy. And at one point, he runs a reformist campaign against a dirty politician, and he loses because he gets caught in a love nest, and that destroys his political ambitions, and he loses the fight. And his guy, Joseph Cotton, who plays his kind of conscience, this artistic, arty guy who follows him around, this sort of speaks to him in his conscience, comes in and gets drunk and rips Charles Foster Kane, Charles Foster Kane rips into him and says this.
It's obvious the people prefer Jim Geddes to me.
You talk about the people as though you own them, as though they belong to you. Goodness. As long as I can remember, you've talked about giving the people their rights, as if you could make them a present of liberty, as a reward for services rendered.
Jed.
Remember the working man?
I'll get drunk too, Jedediah. It'll do any good.
That won't do any good. Besides, you never get drunk. You used to write an awful lot about the working man.
Oh, go on home.
He's turning into something called organized labor.
So he's now attacking this guy for not supporting organized labor, which has never come up in the entire film. He got caught in a love nest. So he could have come in and said you cared, you couldn't keep your pants zipped, and so you sold out all your ideals just to have this babe. Instead, he makes this pitch about organized labor. What I'm saying is the idea that this is the greatest film ever made is just a leftist idea. It's a leftist idea. It's not the greatest film ever made by any stretch of the imagination. And how much of our history, how much of what we think is like that? When John F. Kennedy was killed, the day he was assassinated, the President of the United States, he was assassinated, And who was arrested? Lee Harvey Oswald, a communist sympathizer who hated Kennedy because Kennedy was a ferocious Cold Warrior. And he was afraid that Kennedy was going to hurt Cuba. And so he killed the president of the United States, a leftist who killed the president of the United States. On the day of the newspaper bringing out that headline, they ran a front page editorial by James Reston, one of their biggest guys. The New York Times ran a front page editorial by James Reston. And here's what he said. He said, "The grief we feel is general, for somehow the worst in the nation had prevailed over the best. The indictment extended beyond the assassin, for something in the nation itself, some strain of madness and violence, had destroyed the highest symbol of law and order." And he goes on to say, he says, did the president have a premonition of tragedy, that he who had set out to temper the contrary violences of our national life would be their victim? Last June, when the civil rights riots were at their height and passions were flaring, he spoke to a group of representatives of national organizations. So they connect this with anti-civil rights people. And there were people who hated John F. Kennedy because he was for civil rights and because he moved toward the civil rights movement during his term. But they didn't kill him. A communist killed him. A communist killed him. A leftist killed him. The kind of people that the New York Times have been covering up for and supporting most of this time. Okay. And so they ran this thing saying it was America's fault. It was the hatred in America, the violence in America. It wasn't. It was Cuba and Russia's fault. It was Marxism's fault. It was communism's fault. And yet they ran this thing, and that morphed into this conspiracy. It wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. The bullet danced around in a funny way, and there must have been somebody else on the grassy knoll. All these things that over time have been debunked, but it's too late. I mean, there's this very famous Oliver Stone movie called JFK, where one of the stupidest conspiracy theories was launched in New Orleans by this New Orleans DA. And it was a conspiracy theory about all these evil gay people and conservatives were getting together because they thought that John F. Kennedy was going to pull out of Vietnam, which he wasn't going to do. He was going to pull out of Vietnam, and they wanted to stop him because they were evil conservatives and evil homosexuals. And this guy, who was a loon, he was basically a loon, was then played by Kevin Costner. So he immediately becomes a hero, and he makes this beautiful speech before the jury.
The truth is the most important value we have, because if the truth does not endure, if the government murders truth, if we cannot respect the hearts of these people, then this is not the country in which I was born in, and it's certainly not the country that I want to die in. Tennyson wrote, "Authority forgets a dying king." This was never more true than for John F. Kennedy, whose murder was probably one of the most terrible moments in the history of our country. You, the people, the jury system sitting in judgment on Clay Shaw, represent the hope of humanity against government power. In discharging your duty and bringing the first conviction in this house of cards against Clay Shaw, that's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Do not forget your dying king.
The jury threw this case out in under an hour, as I recall. Maybe that's not quite right, but it was immediately. They threw it out immediately because it was an act of complete lunacy. It had nothing to do with the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, a communist, killed Kennedy. Who killed Kennedy became a byword. That's how powerful narrative is. And this picture was nominated for an Academy Award. That's how powerful narrative is, that paranoia and craziness in order to avoid the truth. Why do you have a conspiracy theory? You have a conspiracy theory because the truth indicts you. That's why you have a conspiracy theory. There was no need for a conspiracy theory. They caught the guy who killed JFK. He was a leftist. He was a communist. He was a Cuba supporter. He was against JFK's Cold War strategy, but they couldn't accept that because they were leftists. They were leftists. They supported communism. And so now we have this entire history of lies that I don't know. Do you know that Kennedy was killed by a lone communist? Do you know that? Before you heard me say it, did you know it? Same thing with the Southern strategy. Remember the Southern strategy? Nixon enlisted all the evil bigots because all that time it was the Democrats. It was the Democrats who were the racists. It was the Dixiecrats, they were called, who were the segregationists. It was the Democrats Democrats who created Jim Crow. It was the Democrats who opposed Lincoln. You know, the other day, Clyburn, the guy from the powerful House Democrat, he came out and said Donald Trump is the worst president since Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the Obama of his day. He was the Obama until about a year ago. He was considered one of the great, elegant, brilliant people until basically Ann Coulter exposed the fact that he was a vicious racist. Blacks were going to him, begging him to change his policies, but he didn't. And the Democrats have been like that forever. What I'm saying is you can't fight a political fight against people who don't know some version of the truth. And people do not know it. They are living in a cloud of lies. They're living in a toxic atmosphere of lies. And if we don't take back the press, and if we don't understand that the battle is for the press, the battle is for the movie industry, the battle is for the Academy, the battle is not for some congressional district in Ohio. If we don't understand that the best thing happening in this country right now is Kayleigh McEnany slapping these people around, then we're just going to lose it all. You can win and win and win elections, but if you lose the narrative, you lose the country because people just think that lies are truth and truth is lies. And it is just amazing how successful the left has been in selling us these lies. We are prisoners of their lies, and we have got to break out of that prison.